Welcome to tonight's Michigan State University Beekeeping Office Hours. I'm here tonight with Megan Milbrath and Dan Wines and our guest presenter, Clarence Rudette. Right, so this is an MSU Extension program. Tonight, this is the agenda we have planned for you. So I'll get us started with announcements. Then Clarence is going to talk to us about the Michigan State University Product Center. Megan will talk about plants in bloom. And then she'll talk about late season nectar late season nectar flows and fall feeding. Dan will talk about feeding honeybees. I'll talk about dealing with high moisture honey and managing varroa, and then we'll all answer your questions. So if you have beekeeping questions now, you can use the Q&A box to enter your questions. All right, so to get us started, we have lots of links and resources that are related to tonight's webinar, and they're all compiled on the video webpage. So you'll find this link in the chat, and you'll find on this webpage, you'll see lots of links to the things that we're talking about tonight. This is also where we will post the webinar recording along with on our YouTube channel. All right, so if you're looking for a page of just general resources, especially if you're hearing from people who want to get started with beekeeping in Michigan, but don't really know where to start, this is a nice place where you can find lots of resources, including some of our online courses and web pages for getting started. All right, if you're looking for our upcoming events, you can go to pollinators.msu.edu and then click the events tab. We're going to highlight a few of our upcoming events tonight. So one is the Michigan Beekeepers Association's Fall Conference, which will be held on Saturday, October 19th at Benzie Central High School. And registration is open now, so you can go ahead and register. The conference is on Saturday, but the night before, there's also an optional tour of a beekeeping operation or honey house, and then a pizza party. So if you go to our page here of events, you'll find lots of opportunities, but a couple of cool ones. One is that Melanie Kirby is the keynote presenter at the Michigan Beekeepers Association Fall Conference, and she is doing a pre-conference webinar. So y'all can hear how awesome of a presenter she is, and then know that you should show up to the in-person conference. She's speaking on the importance of place, power, and purpose in pollinator stewardship. So that's going to be a webinar, and that webinar was added to the series of beekeeping office hours. So if you're signed up and listening today, you'll automatically be able to use your same link and get reminders for this webinar, and that will take place on October 2nd at 7 p.m. And then another pre-conference opportunity is a Zoom meeting. So Stephanie Slater did a nice webinar before the spring conference on how to enter and prepare honey show entries. And she is offering to do a Q&A session. So she's asking everyone to watch the recording first, where she gives lots of tips and tricks. And then she's just open to sharing lots of feedback and ideas through this Q&A session. This is a Zoom meeting, so you will be able to interact, but that means that the registration is separate. So if you want to join this, make sure you go and register for that Zoom meeting. All right, our next webinar, we are rescheduling. So instead of being on Monday, September 23rd, it will be on Monday, September 16th at our same time of 7 o'clock Eastern. So the Zoom information will be updated shortly or soon, and we hope that you can join us on September 16th. All right, and then again, we post a lot of our webinar recordings to our YouTube channel. You can find webinars from previous years there as well. And then if you want to stay connected, you can sign up for our newsletter, our Pollinators and Pollination News Digest. We also have an Ask Extension form. So some people emailed me questions before tonight's webinar to ask us to answer the questions tonight. If you have questions between webinars, the best way to ask them is by using the Ask Extension form. All right, and then we also have a fundraising campaign going on right now. So if you know someone who wants to support beekeeping and pollinator education and outreach work, you can direct them to our crowdfunding site. Clarence is up next. And as a reminder, this year we've had some special guests give presentations on specific topics related or programs from Michigan State University or resources that are of interest to beekeepers. So tonight, Clarence is going to talk about the Product Center.
Well, thank you and welcome everybody. A little background of me. I've been keeping bees for over 10 years now, and I think we are incredibly fortunate to have Anna and Megan and Dan as part of this outreach team and doing office hours. As a beekeeper, I can't tell you how valuable that outreach is. So I work for the MSU Product Center. I'm an innovation counselor, and I also manage the Food Agriculture Research and Manufacturing Accelerator that's located in Muskegon. One of the things the MSU Product Center does is the Making in Michigan conference, which if you're wanting to do a consumer packaged good of any type, including honey, wax, anything else, we have a big trade show where we bring in buyers that then can actually utilize making those sales. So the MSU Product Center, we provide services to all food packaged food products, include honey and honey products. We do label reviews, nutritional facts and labeling, ingredient label consultation, packaging assistance, and a process authority review, which I'll talk about a little bit later. We also do market research and strategic planning. Client services, there's an $100 application fee, and you can see that. Go to the website on that QR code. Provides unlimited business counseling, connection to resources that you'll see on that website, store buyer access, and the Making in Michigan conference that I mentioned, and some production facilities. Not the honey house down on campus, I do want to say that. Production facilities at the Food Processing Innovation Center in Okemos, and then the farm facility that I help manage. And we do have some scholarships to cover those client services depending on your demographics. MSU Product Center services for honey. I'm the lead innovation counselor. And I just want to hit a couple of things real quickly to make sure everybody is doing the right thing. If you are on the licensing exemption, I want to make sure to stress that just because you might be under that $15,000 mark, you still need to go through and follow the federal guidelines, Michigan food law, the GAMPS, MDARD guidelines, and note that if there is an issue that pops up, you may still get visited by MDARD. They still may show up. What that exemption allows is you don't have to pay that fee and you don't have to go through the upfront inspection. The two pictures I have on here was from actually Saturday at a farmer's market I was at. Labeling is always the issues. They're inaccurate, mislabeled, no label at all. I recommend do lot codes. If you don't do lot codes, there was a company that had an issue and they had to destroy 5 years of product that they had, and they filed for bankruptcy after that. Do lot codes. I do a reverse date, pretty simple. Recommend that you do that. The big thing right now is infused honey. Infused honey does not fall underneath the honey exemption. If you do infused honey, there's a process authority review that we can do or some lab work. It's required by MDARD if you're infusing liquids or putting liquids into that. Dry material, MDARD has given some leeway on, but they still want to know what that happens to be. Basically, what we do, we can tell pretty quickly, test pH and water activity after you do that infusion until figure out if that falls into that. And infused honey, since it's not pure honey, does not fall underneath the exemption. It falls under the cottage food law. And the two example pictures I have here, this one I thought was interesting. I asked the person selling how they infused their blueberry honey, and they said the bees bring it in. That is not an infused honey. That's a varietal honey. And infused honey is when you're adding something to that. And then the picture on the right, that's their label, was on that tag, raw wildfire honey. There was no labeling about source, lot codes, any of the requirements for the labeling guidelines. You can use a tag like that, but you need to make sure you have all of that stuff there. Next. We also assist with honey house layout and design. I would reach out to Dan on that if you have questions. That one on campus is really nice. We'll review your GAMPs for production. Co-manufacturing of infused honey will help you go through, make sure you're following those guidelines. We don't want anybody to get sick. Co-packaging, we can do that. I think we will have a machine that will be able to do straws. We're demoing and testing that out here in September to find out if we'll add that to our pieces of equipment. Also help with that value-added producer grants. So the MDARD one is coming up. And honey does qualify as a value-added product if you are doing something more than selling that wholesale. And we assist with some value-added product development. One things I don't have on here is propolis. There is a significant propolis market that we have some people in Michigan here that basically collect from beekeepers all over. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, we can help with that, and we'll help with other non-food items in the honey world. So if you're doing some cosmetics and wax, normally we don't do cosmetics, but in this case we do because it's related to honey. And next. So we have 13 areas in the state, 14 areas in the state. Each of these areas have a product innovation counselor. I'm kind of statewide in honey, but reach out to any of those innovation counselors in those areas. You can find that on our Product Center website. And if they have questions they can't answer, they'll forward them to me or get to some of the experts. Couple of sources. The first link there, that has basically all of the information producing value-added products. With honey, the MDARD regulations and requirements, I think there's a half a dozen links on there that will take you through and get more information in that. If you want some light reading, there's a 90-page document that have the federal requirements, and then the Michigan Beekeeping Rules and Regulations with Anna, Megan, and Dan have, I think Megan actually did the article, but just as a reminder, there's some stuff on there in terms of honey products. I encourage all of you to get involved in, if you're not giving away honey and you're actually selling it, please reach out. And I can save questions to the very end of tonight or take them whatever you would want me to do.
There's a couple questions now for you, so
Okay.
I think that would be good to go through. So
Yeah.
one question is the Product Center involved in the development or oversee any of the cottage laws in the state?
So we meet with MDARD on a regular basis, and they actually kind of rely on our input that we get from beekeepers and food producers as they're going through that, because there's a lot of when new things come along, they're kind of in the dark a little bit, and there's been a lot of changeover with MDARD and some of those. So there's an educational process that we try to bring along, but we have no say in terms of what the actual regulations are. If I had my way, that exemption would be much higher than 15,000 because all my honey has to go wholesale or I'll pop over that amount.
Thanks. The next question is, in some states, when you create and sell infused honey, you must charge and collect tax on the sale. Is that the case in Michigan?
It is not. So and I don't want to avoid this question. My first point is going to be that it falls underneath the cottage food law once you do the infusion. So it's no longer under the exemption. There are people who will infuse bourbon barrel aged honey is a big thing. You need to be very careful that you don't go over that 0.5% alcohol in that. If you do, you'll need to apply for an exemption through the Liquor Control Commission, and you could be taxed on that. And again, I would recommend to reach out to our team when it comes infusing with anything liquid, even if it's alcohol, so we can make sure, number one, that your product's safe, that it'll meet the process authority review, and that you're not violating any of the other laws around that.
Great. And then when is the next trade show?
So the next trade show is usually we do them in April at the Lansing Center. It may be at a different location. It's usually the third week in April, and it is open to the public. So you can come and see what vendors are doing. We do usually have about 150 vendors. If you would like to be a vendor and meet with buyers, the information on registration for that will happen in January. Awesome. And then the next slide is my information. If you want to get a hold of me, I don't mind calling on my cell or texting me, but you need to identify who you are. If it's a call, it will go to voicemail. I don't take calls unless I know who they're from, because I get so much spam. And then at any time, even if you are a client or not a client, go to my calendar, try to set up something on that schedule. Usually on clients, I don't reach out to them unless they have a need or we have something set up. So please do not be afraid to use my calendar and set something up if you want to talk. Before you want to become a client, you might only have a couple of questions, and we don't require you to become a client if it's something simple. So again, thank you very much, and don't be afraid to reach out to any of the product innovation counselors or myself.
Thank you so much, Clarence. These are really great resources for beekeepers, especially those who want to sell their honey.
Thank you. I appreciate getting the time here.
For sure. All right, next up we have Megan talking about plants in bloom.
And thanks, Anna, and thanks, Clarence. That was great. I am actually a stand-in for Zachary, a less funny stand-in, as he is in Japan for the International Congress on Entomology, and we're all very jealous. So this one is actually my photo, but the rest of them, except for one of them, which is Anna's, are going to be Zachary's lovely photos. So we still get his great photos while he's gone. And so the main plant that everybody's talking about, and some of us are smelling, is goldenrod. We have many, many species of goldenrod in Michigan, including one we mentioned last time, early goldenrod. And depending where you are in the state will determine very much how important this one is. The big two, which are kind of the weedy species of goldenrod, are Solidago altissima and Solidago canadensis, which is like the tall goldenrod and Canadian goldenrod. And they should be blooming like where we are in Ingham County in the center of the state, like they're nearing peak bloom. And that's the one that usually drives the bulk of it. For me, I've been in Michigan like 15 years keeping bees-ish. I don't know how, a while, and it sometimes blooms a lot, and then sometimes we get nothing, and sometimes we get in between, and it's not all over the state, but this can be a big one for a lot of people. And then there's a lot of other little things. This is American burnweed. And it kind of looks like a dandelion-ish blossom when it's done, and it's a very shallow rooted thing that goes up. This is a cool picture because I haven't even seen bees foraging on it like this, but it does open up into a yellow, and it's a very fast growing plant. And then bone sets, which one of my favorites, that's going right now in a lot of wetland areas. So that's the Eupatorium. Oh. And then, which is, yeah, blooming right now for, I was thinking about Joe Pye weed too, as well. I was thinking about other plants that we should have gotten in there, and I got distracted in my own flower thoughts. But boneset is a big one along wetlands, and then alfalfa can be a little bit, but we obviously in Michigan mostly cut that down before it even blooms, or especially before it's 10% bloom. Buckwheat is a big one, and is especially a big one if you're planting it. So at MSU, Dan actually arranged for our land around the bee building to have buckwheat in bloom, and you can plant it that was probably planted in July. So that's a nice cover crop. Okay, I'm seeing a nod, but that's usually like end of June, beginning of July, you can put it in so that it blooms right now. So it's a really short time to bloom. So it's an excellent cover crop to put in, and it reseeds itself a lot really well too. And it makes a dark honey that is some people love and some people don't love, but you can easily sell it in Michigan. And then sedum is a lovely plant to have in, you see it a lot in like more formal landscaped areas, but the bees of all sorts love it. We have a lot on the MSU campus right now. And winged sumac, and I've seen some dwarf sumacs blooming right now. So there are still sumacs blooming depending which kinds that you have. And cut plant, this one is my whole front ditch. I have like a quarter acre of this plant, and we have it all around the pavilion at MSU too. So this is really, really tall. It's Silphium perfoliatum, and it is beautiful. Bees are all over it. And then very soon, when the flowers close up, the goldfinches love the seeds, and they're all over it too. And it's a really, really gorgeous plant, and it grows like 6 feet tall every single year. And then it's an annual, so it's a perennial, but it'll completely die back, and then it'll grow about 6 feet tall. It's not shrubby. And then butter and eggs, which is again like a little ditch plant that you can see, that's still going, along with a lot of the ditch plants like everlasting pinks and some of the vetches and things like that are still continuing. And then tansy, which is an invasive, that is or in a lot of places it is an invasive, but you can see it. It's a very tall flower with usually yellow that's kind of spread through rhizomes. And then this is Anna's beautiful photo of the seven sun tree, which is a really lovely shrub that blooms very late. Like a lot of our shrubs generally bloom at the beginning of the season. But there is still quite a bit out there. I'm still seeing loosestrife and jewelweed and lots of things. Joe Pyeweed, I mentioned. Ironweed is still going. The hibiscus is going if you have that. So there are still lots of things, and depending whether or not most places we have had enough rain that there is still nectar in some of the places. And then also I still see some star thistle going too around here. So lots of potential things for blooming right now. All right, so then the next part I'm going into is basically, if you don't have the blooms, what we're dealing with. So I kind of covered some of the nectar flows. Go ahead. And really, either Mother Nature is providing the food or you do. So I mentioned this is actually Rydell's goldenrod, which is my current favorite goldenrod. And either you have goldenrod flow or you have stuff coming in, or you're too far north, or the weather isn't compliant, or you haven't had enough water and there's not flow. This is a really, really important time of year because they're building up for winter, and then also you're raising your winter bees. So somebody has to be feeding your bees right now. As I mentioned, sometimes I don't have to do anything at this time of year. Where I am in Jackson County, where my bees are, there's definitely stuff coming in. But there are other years that we'll have a really big drought in July, and I will see goldenrod everywhere, and it's just not putting out nectar. Or you'll see goldenrod about to bloom, and then it just rains the whole week that it's blooming, and you don't get anything. So there should be incoming food right now, and either you're getting a bloom or you're going to have to be feeding. And this time of year, your bees could be needing a lot of weight. And so that's why I have this photo with the buckets. It's not just a mason jar, it's lots of weight. And you need to account for what they need to eat and their storage. So I mentioned they're still raising brood in most of the state, and they are currently raising our winter bees, or probably will be in most places. We don't know an exact date for that. And they're still going to be eating food. And especially if it's warm and they're out foraging, they're going to be going through a lot of food resources. And then you also want them to get up to weight for winter. A common rule of thumb that we say is about 100 pounds of storage here, which is like 130 pounds whole hive weight. Um, you can go out and weigh it, or eventually you learn how to heft it. But one of the mistakes that we'll see is people not feeding enough at this time of year, because if you have your hives on a scale, sometimes you can watch it where you put a bucket on and you see that the weight instantly goes up, but the bees eat down that bucket and then the weight is overall the same. So you didn't actually get over the amount that they need. It was still useful because you fed them and they didn't eat their stores, but it didn't allow them to build up to that heavy winter weight. So it might be that you have got a great fall flow, your bees are putting it away, and you do not have to feed this year. It might be that it's just not happening, or your colony is too small and you don't have the resources, and this would be the time that we generally would start feeding. And the other thing that has to happen is you have to backfill the brood nest. So in the spring, when we're talking about swarm control, we are talking about like keep the nectar out of the brood nest, keep the nectar out of the brood nest, keep giving them space. And now, after months of that messaging, we're saying put the nectar back in the brood nest, and we actually want them to start filling that brood nest. And if you think about it, that's a pretty large volume. It's a larger, it can be if you have a big colony. And so that is a lot of nectar or syrup to put into the hive to fill that. And then this one, I think, is one of the most important points, is that we want them to be storing ripened off food. We want them to be storing dry honey. We don't want them to have a lot of moisture in the hive. So sometimes people are like, oh, I can wait, let them, have this goldenrod, and then I'm going to take honey off and then I can feed. And by the time they get buckets on, it's October. And again, that can be useful just for something for them to eat so they don't use their resources, but they won't have time to dry off all of that honey, especially as we get into colder weather and they have fewer working hours or warm working hours in the day. So if you have hives that are light, make sure that you start feeding them a lot of food and very early. And again, if you're in a place where you've still got nectar coming in, this is going to be less of a concern. Yeah, more than you think and earlier than you think. All right. And then at this time of year, we generally say 2-to-1 versus 1-to-1. So that's 2-to-1 sugar to water. It's close enough in mass that you can just do it by weight or volume. So I usually use volume because it's a little easier, so I'll use a gallon of water and a gallon of sugar or something like that. Here, this is actually at Auburn where they do it in a big drum and they have students that just use a paddle. I usually use a paint stirrer in a 5-gallon bucket. And then I know this is a question that I get all the time, is what type of sugar, if it has to be beet sugar or cane sugar, if it has to be organic or brown sugar, as long as it is white sugar sucrose, so beet or cane, the bees do not care. Chemically, because it's so pure, it is the same from the bees' perspective. So if you want to have beet sugar because you want to support the Michigan beet industry, great. If you want to do cane sugar because you're not as concerned about the slash and burn practices and it's more important for you that it's non-GMO, you can do that. And those are your own values and your own decisions. It has nothing from a bee health perspective. They're exactly the same. The things that make it different is like their planting history, but that doesn't come through the sugar itself, as long as it's white sugar. The one thing that you can mix up is doing like a brown sugar or sugar in the raw. That's going to have a lot of indigestible solids. With the bees, we want them to have really like a very, very clean food that's just giving them clean calories to supplement all the nutrients they have already in the hive. All right.
Great, thanks. Now Dan's off to talk about feeding honeybees.
Yeah, so Megan kind of talked about the why and the when and the what of it, and I just talk kind of on the how we actually get this into our hives. And when we're thinking fall feeding in Michigan, I'm always thinking syrup. We're most places in the state, certainly where I've ever kept bees, we're blessed with good pollen throughout the year, particularly in the fall. So when I'm thinking about fall feeding, I'm thinking in the syrup and getting them up to weight for winter. So kind of 3 primary types of feeders to talk a little bit about. The first is just kind of the broad term is like gravity feeders. You also hear them referred to as buckets or syrup cans or things like that. And as the name implies, gravity, it's basically you've got this volume, like a 1 gallon bucket is very common. And then you've got a lid on it, and that lid will either have, as we see in the photo below it, it's got little pinholes in it in the lid, or it'll have a mesh screen. And so when you fill that with syrup and then you invert it and you place it over the colony, they're either going to have access through their inner cover, like in this left photo with a bucket, or if you have a like a migratory style lid, there'll be a hole in the lid that they'll come right through and get access to either those pinholes or that mesh. And once you've inverted it, it forms a vacuum. So it doesn't rain down on the bees. They're kind of taking from it, drinking from it, I guess kind of like a hamster feeder works as they take some, there's more available, but it's not it's not pouring down into the hive. So gravity feeders can be a great option. One thing to really be careful is that your bucket or whatever your volume that you're putting this or your container you're putting this liquid in is well sealed. This picture on the right here, this is a leaky bucket, and we see just this crazy robbing frenzy happening. So you do need to be careful that your buckets don't leak and you're not kind of spilling weeping syrup into the yard and then ending up with these kind of robbing frenzies. So that's definitely something you want to check. Another small caveat, and I say these because I've done these on myself, including the robbing. The mesh screens that come on the buckets, the bees can sometimes propolize though. You see that one in the photo there, in the middle, the bottom. It's a little bit propolised, but there's still a pretty good area that the bees can get at. But particularly if you leave the buckets on a long time after they've gone empty, the bees will just propolize it. You can fix that by using like a barbecue lighter or something underneath it, just a little bit of gentle heat, warm it up, and then tap it. It'll actually dislodge, provided all the buckets I've had with mesh are metal screens. So you can use a little heat. You obviously don't want to be melting your plastic. So that's one thing you'll notice, and say a little bit of heat and then loosen up that propolis and give it a tap. You can usually dislodge it. The other thing that I've done wrong with these gravity style feeders is particularly in the fall, as Megan mentioned, we want this heavier syrup, this 2-to-1 or as close as you can get. So your liquid gets pretty saturated. And if you don't get complete dissolving of your sugar and you have even a tiny amount of granular sugar still remaining, when you flip it over and your bucket, is on the hive over time, all that sugar is going to settle down and it can physically plug up that mesh screen or those holes. So if you're going to use a gravity feeder like this, you really need to make sure that you have every bit of granular sugar dissolved into that syrup. So again, learning from experience, but these bucket feeders can be great. 1 gallon's common. I've seen 2 and 3 gallon out there. You can use a 2-liter soda bottle, or I've seen 1 gallon glass mason jars. But these buckets and cans are available through all your bee supply companies. So if you want to get something ready-made for the purpose, they're out there. Also, beekeepers DIY a lot of stuff and recycle things. So the next kind of major type of feeder that's commonly used, I call them frame feeders. I've heard them called division board feeders as well. But basically it takes the place of one or more frames in a colony. And it's just a big trough. But it sits in the colony parallel to the frames. It hangs down and it provides a reservoir that you can fill with syrup, depending on the dimensions. So these do come in both deep and, again, from your bee supply companies. You can get them in deep or medium. So if you use all medium boxes, these are still an option. Again, of course, the volume is going to be less. They also come in a variety of widths. The most standard for the deep is like 1.5 inches wide, and that holds a gallon of syrup. But I think they come to about 3 inches wide. That would actually replace a couple frames, and those hold up to 2 gallons. So the frame feeder being in the colony is a really nice option. I've found bees take syrup out of them really quickly. One fairly recent improvement, I'd say in the last, 5 or 6 years, they've become pretty commonplace, is this picture on the far right. Is what's called a cap and ladder. So one of the issues that I previously had, and I know a lot of beekeepers didn't like these type of feeders, was bee drowning. If you fill this reservoir with syrup, bees get in, they get sticky and wet and they kind of can't climb out. So now there are these feeders come with this wooden top, and then there are typically I've seen two. It's kind of a mesh. A ladder is what it's called, I guess. It's a mesh tube that allows bees access down into the syrup. But if they do fall in, they've got something to crawl out on. So I think that's been a real nice improvement. You can still pour feed in relatively easily through those holes are typically like an inch and a half in diameter, an inch plus anyways. I usually, if I'm feeding small scale, if I'm a 5-gallon bucket tipping the feed out, I'll take a funnel or something with me to get it in there. But the frame feeders can be a really nice option. I like them and use them. You can leave them in hives year round if you want. I often will do that, particularly in double deep colonies where I'm not so concerned about giving up a frame of brood space area for a feeder. So I typically in doubles leave them in frame feeders in year round. And then the third major type of feeder that is out there and is used is top feeder. And what that is, so that's going to be it's a box, like your bee box. So most commonly either 8 or 10 frame. I suppose you could make something for a 5 frame if you were doing, stacked up nukes. And usually they're like a shallow depth, somewhere in the 5 inches or so. And they come with, well, you can either buy the inserts and put them in your own box, or you can buy the whole ready to go with the box. I often, if I have rotten boxes that are still, rotten at the corners, and I can cut them down to be the suitable height for these, you can kind of still get some life out of that box and just buy the plastic insert. But most commonly, they've got 2 reservoirs on either side here. And then they've got a mesh screen running down the middle. So the bees actually come up through the middle of it and can get access to syrup in those tubs on either side. But again, like with the cap and ladder and the frame feeder, it keeps the bees from falling in and drowning. You see the picture on the left. It's a little hard to see, but basically, the syrup in the foreground that's reflected in clouds. And then behind that screen is those bees that have come up through the middle. They can readily drink that syrup, but they don't fall in and drown. So one, I really like the top feeders. They're high volume. I think typically you get about 4 gallons in a 10 frame top feeder. And so that's particularly useful for, I have some colonies that are a fair distance from home that it's kind of a, if I can put 4 gallons on at once rather than 4 separate trips to put a gallon on, that's really nice, the high volume. Also, I run some colonies in single brood nests. And so when I strip all the honey off in the fall, they can be really light down in that brood nest. And I need to get a lot of weight on in a pretty short window. So giving them, say multiple gallons at one time to really put that winter weight on them in a hurry, as the high volume is nice. And you kind of can replenish this feeder without disturbing the colony. You're just popping off the lid or the inner cover. You do want to make sure, that you've got a bee-tight lid, inner cover, whatever it is. If you need to use a little duct tape or something, because if you put all that syrup on top, remember the bees have kind of that indirect access through the mesh to get to it, but they're not able to defend them against anyone that would be entering from the top of it. So you need that lid to be bee-tight on top of it. So those are kind of the 3 primary pieces of equipment that you can feed bees. Pros and cons to all of them. They all have their place depending on your scenario. No right or wrong to it, just kind of personal preference. You can try them out and you'll probably develop a favorite. Couple of resources that are out there. The Honeybee Health Coalition, we always promote their guide to managing varroa. Recently, in the last, I'd say less than a year, they've put out this honeybee nutrition guide. I will say it primarily focuses on, protein nutrition and what that means for the colony, but there is a section on carbohydrates and feeding syrup and why that's important, and a lot of those things that Megan's discussed. So this is a really good resource through the Honeybee Health Coalition website. Just something good to add to your beekeeping library. It's out there and available in PDF form online for free. So that's a great resource. And then Zachary, who again wasn't able to join us tonight, but he has a really nice document on feeding honeybees as well, kind of the when, the why, the how, summarizing a lot of what we talked about here. But if you like hard copies of something, or this is available in PDF, easy to find online. It's on our beekeeping links and resources, so this is a good read as well. So that's kind of the how of feeding bees, and Anna's going to talk about honey and high moisture honey.
Great, thank you. So after our webinar last month, we got a lot of questions about dealing with frames that were still mostly uncapped from beekeepers who wanted to harvest the honey and beekeepers who were concerned that what they'd be harvesting would be high moisture. So we're going to talk a little bit about some options. So one piece of advice we can offer you is to not pull honey supers during a nectar flow. If you see your bees are bringing in lots of nectar, you can expect that you're going to have a lot of moisture in those honey frames because the nectar has a lot of moisture in it, and you need to give the bees time to dry it out. So for some people, beekeepers, it might just be a matter of leaving the honey boxes or the supers on the hive for more time to give the bees more time to dry the nectar into honey. Sometimes beekeepers have in their head a specific time or weekend when they want to be harvesting their honey, and maybe in some cases you're going to be better off if you leave the honey supers on and give the bees more time to dry the honey and then to cap it. Some other options for you. One is to use a dehumidifier to dry your honey before you extract it. So after you pull your honey supers, if you're concerned that it might be a little bit higher moisture, you can put the honey supers in a room with the dehumidifier. And I like to try to arrange those honey supers so that they're pretty exposed. So instead of having a nice, neat stack of honey supers, we'll kind of put them all on their own base or make sure that there's a lot of airflow that the frames can receive, and then run that dehumidifier for a couple of days before extracting honey. And that, I think, is preferable to trying to do it after extraction. So if you're in a position where you've already extracted your honey, you use a honey refractometer and find that the moisture level is a little bit high. Honey should be 18.6% moisture or lower. So if you're finding that it's a little bit high, you can use a dehumidifier to try to dry it. One way that I've seen before is using some kind of food safe bin that's kind of big and where you can kind of shallow, so you have when you have the honey in it, a lot of the honey is exposed, and you can run a dehumidifier in the room. With this situation, you want to make sure that it's a really clean environment so you're not getting critters into the honey and contaminating it. I have heard, so another option for you is if you have some low moisture honey, you can mix it with your higher moisture honey to try to balance things out. Some beekeepers decide to use higher moisture honey for making mead because mead has a fermentation process. I've talked to some serious mead makers and they prefer to use the regular moisture honey instead of the high moisture honey. But I guess a lot of that's going to depend on you and how seriously you take mead making. And then, if it's maybe just a little bit high, but it hasn't started fermenting and it's just for your own consumption and it's not very much honey, you might consume it before it starts to ferment, but you wouldn't want to sell anything that's above 18.6% moisture or that's subject to fermenting. Couple other options for you. So if you have a lot of nectar that's really, really wet, so like let's say maybe your bees are bringing in goldenrod nectar right now and you don't, and it's in your honey supers and you're not going to extract it. A strategy that only works some of the time is to try to get the bees to move it down. So the way I've done this is to put the inner cover on top of the brood boxes and then the honey super with that really high moisture on top of it, and then the telescoping cover on top of the super. And sometimes if it's really high moisture nectar still, it shakes out of frames really easily, then sometimes putting the honey super above the inner cover will prompt the bees to bring the nectar down to the brood nest. It doesn't work all the time though, in my experience. Another thing you can do is if you're really struggling and you're, maybe it's only just one super, you might decide at the end of the day to designate that as a brood box and leave it with your bees year round instead of extract it. Normally we try to extract anything in the honey supers, but sometimes it might make sense for you to leave it on the hive in certain situations. All right, so moving on to varroa. Again, the Honeybee Health Coalition has the Tools for Varroa Management Guide with your different treatment options. As beekeepers are harvesting honey, they might find that there's different treatments available to them. So Our thymol-based treatments like Apiguard and Apolife Bar aren't labeled for use with honey supers on, but after you extract your honey and you don't have honey supers on, you might decide to consider other treatments. We're still also looking at formic acid or formic pro for colonies that still do have honey supers on, and then paying really close attention to temperatures, because right now in the Lansing area, it is very hot. But any treatment that you do, you'd want to read the label and follow it completely in its entirety. And then just a kind of reminder, as we have kind of dearthy periods, so periods where there's not nectar on the landscape, we might start to see more of this robbing behavior where honeybees rob honey from a different hive. So they enter a hive, they take honey, and then they return to their hive, and they'll recruit other foragers to rob honey. And this is also one of the places where we're concerned about varroa mites transferring from one colony to another. So just to be on the lookout, you don't want to have your hive open for too long during inspection, because then you're exposing honey to the robber bees. And if you are concerned about robbing, one tool is a robbing screen. So it's something that you can buy from a beekeeping supply store or make at home, but basically it's mesh to reduce the amount of space that the guard bees have to guard at the entrance, and then the mesh still allows for some airflow. All right, we'll have a survey at the end of the webinar, so that should pop up on your screen and also be in the follow-up emails. And then again, here are the resources that we shared tonight. So a lot of the topics that we covered have a lot more information, and you'll find them on the links on this page. All right, here's our acknowledgments. And then I'm going to start going into questions. We had a few questions that came through today from people who wanted them answered tonight on the webinar. So I'll read, or Megan, do you want to read this one off?
Sure. So the question is, we want to switch from using deep brood boxes to medium brood boxes. When and how is the best way to do this to cause the least disruption in the hive? Do you want to take this one, Anna?
Sure. So, I mean, one thought that's not a happy thought is that if you do have colonies that don't make it, so you have dead out, that's the easiest time to switch out equipment. Another thought is that once your bees make it through the winter, that's when they'll likely be using the least amount of frames. So you could use that as an opportunity to see which frames they're not using and then pull those frames out. Another option could be to so when you split your colonies in the spring, maybe put a deep box on each hive and then add mediums. And so that'll mean that you're still having deep brood boxes in your operation, at least for the time being, but you could have like the deep box on the bottom and then medium brood boxes above it if you want to kind of phase in those medium brood boxes.
Mm-hmm. All right. Many sugar manufacturers are declining to identify their product as cane sugar, meaning that it may contain primarily beet sugar. Does it matter to the bees whether syrup for feeding is made from beet sugar? This time of year, 2 parts sugar to 1 part water is the recommended concentration. And then there is another question in the chat that says, what's the main difference usage of 2-to-1 versus 1-to-1 spring versus fall? So I'll just reiterate the first one, even though I touched on it. It is a question that I get all of the time. And just for reference, bees can naturally eat sucrose. So when we get white table sugar, it is sucrose. In nectars, they usually get a combination of glucose, fructose, and sucrose, and then other sugars in minor amounts. The hypopharyngeal gland of the bees, when they get older, actually produces an enzyme called invertase, which is designed to break down the sucrose, which is a disaccharide, into simple sugars. So sucrose is absolutely in their diet, as long as it's pure sucrose. And the refining process that we have for making white sugar, both out of cane sugar and out of beet sugar, is very, very good. So if you're getting a refined white sugar, it is going to be sucrose, and there isn't a lot of things left over. So as long as you're getting pure sucrose from the bee health perspective, it's totally fine. Like I said, there's other issues you can get involved with, but it is completely the same from the bee side. The 2-to-1 is denser with sugar, and it makes it easier at this time of year when they have to dry it down or we don't want to have a lot of moisture. So in the springtime, we want to have something that's closer to nectar and that, they're just eating a lot more quickly. And so you can go to 1-to-1. It's not the end of the world if you use 1-to-1 in the fall or 2-to-1 in the spring. Like those are both perfectly fine. The bees can make comb out of both of them. 1-to-1 is a little easier to mix up because you don't have to have the water quite so hot to get it into a saturated solution. So you can often do it with hot tap water. 2-to-1, you get more calories in with fewer buckets. So they're just kind of some logistical pros and cons. But you kind of want to think about you want less moisture in the fall and they can handle more moisture in the spring. All right. So Dan, do you want to make some predictions on dearths? So this is person, it says, when do you think our dearth will begin this year? Over between Flint and Davison.
I don't know. I mean, it's hard. I mean, I don't even know in the yards that I've had bees in for 7 years. I don't, I'm kind of best I'm doing is looking at the landscape and kind of guessing. Um, but as we talked about earlier, when Megan was talking about the flowers, it looks like a lot of the state, and I would put the Flint general vicinity in that. Goldenrod is pretty close to peak. There's a lot of it out there. We are very hot today. The rest of the week is supposed to be warm as well. So I don't think it's gonna, as far as the progression of the bloom, I don't expect the breaks to come on that anytime soon. Could mean the goldenrod is kind of, past its best in 10 days or so here. So I would think, by the time we get into early September, there may be a dribble still, but I would think that, things have tended to run early this year, from what I've seen as far as the timing of blooms. So goldenrod wrapping up a little, early September as opposed to mid-September would not surprise me this year. But you've really kind of gotta see. I've got yards, that their late summer dearth can vary by 3 weeks, and those yards are, 15 miles apart. So
I think that last point is the most. I've definitely had people where I've gone on a house visit and they said, like, I don't know what's happening with my bees because goldenrod's blooming everywhere, and their colony was actually starving. And it was because they were in a suburb and like goldenrod was blooming everywhere, but not within their flight distance. So depends, just look in your hives. All right, thank you for that. So Dan, there's a couple more on feeders. So one is I'll read the comment and then there's a question that seems to be related. So Rick says, I use top feeders, and if there is a top entrance, it can open up the hive to robbing. So be careful to block the upper entrances, which is true. And then someone said, I bought a top feeder last season, had a terrible experience with huge drowning. Do I need to put on a tight inner cover and ensure no bee access?
yeah, so you definitely there's a couple different things that could be happening and be hard to determine, but are those bees coming from outside your hive as robbers, or are they drowning from inside the hive? So having a tight inner cover will prevent those external bees coming in and robbing and some of them drowning. One thing I have had happen is I mentioned, you've got that hardware cloth steel mesh running down between the chambers. And you want to look at that and make sure that's actually bee tight. It should be bee tight, but occasionally they're pliable, things get bent. If it's been damaged or bumped and it's, doesn't take much of a gap for a bee to find its way through. And I have had that where I opened a top feeder, the syrup was gone. There'd been some drowning, there was hundreds of dead bees. And when I looked at the perimeter of that mesh, I could see, there was a gap basically enough that a bee could get in, you know, and basically just a pair of pliers, bend that mesh down, tighten it up so it was actually bee tight from the bottom. So make sure your feeder is bee tight from the top externally, and then that your mesh is going to be bee tight from the bottom so they can drink the syrup, but they can't swim in it.
Excellent. Yeah, that is a horrible sight when you open it up and it's just full of dead bees.
Stinks.
It stinks. It's gross. It's sad.
Yeah.
So Tina asked, what date do you recommend stopping feeding to ensure drying? October 1st across the state. I'm just kidding.
Um, yeah, there's no hard date. I mean, it's one of those if they need it, you know, I do try to, I kind of look at September as feeding month and try to be, mostly done with it by the start of October, but it's not telling you, I don't, if things are still a little light, they're not going to get a gallon or two in October. The past fall, it's been fine because we've had pretty warm falls and plenty of drying time. But if we get one of those, cold, damp falls, that feeding into October may bite me. So I try to have the vast majority of it wrapped up by the end of September. And, if it's just a spot bucket here and there, so be it in October. But yeah, I try to get that work earlier is better. So.
Did you want to talk about how we've got a lot of feeding questions, so I'm just going to keep feeding them to you, Dan.
Yep.
Clarence laughed. Thank you. How do the zip bags work for feeding?
Yeah, I actually did this spring for the first time. Worked reasonably well. Can be a little messy, but and so what this method is Ziploc bags full of syrup, and then you poke a few holes in, or with like a little razor knife, cut some slits in it. And so again, the bees have access. You want the holes and the slits on the top again, so it's not raining down. But the bees will come up and again kind of drink that syrup. And it works surprisingly well. One thing you definitely need is some sort of rim, like a shim. Sometimes people use those to put a protein patty on, or like I have some there. They must be like an inch and a quarter, inch and a half. And so putting like 2 1-gallon Ziploc bags, so they weren't bursting full with a full gallon. They probably had, a little more than a half gallon each, but kind of putting those two on. Definitely want to start poking holes in them once they're in place. You don't want to start trying to handle a semi-perforated bag of syrup. But the bees took it reasonably. I mean, they took it well. You are kind of left, there's plastic waste. You're not going to reuse these bags. You are kind of left with a sticky, bunch of Ziploc bags at the end of it. But
Can I jump in?
For first go, it worked reasonably well. So Anna, do you have experience?
Yeah, so when I was in Central America, so this is a different climate and different subspecies of honeybee we were working with. We did a lot of feeding in plastic bags. We didn't use like the zip style. We just used the thin plastic bags and filled them with sugar syrup, tied a knot at the top, and we put them in place of a frame. So instead of using a rim like Dan was saying, we would just remove a frame and put them on the side. And we didn't poke any holes, and the bees figured it out. They made their own little holes, and it worked fine that way. So not sure how it would go here in Michigan, but that was how I've experienced it.
And I did add a link to the chat from Rusty Burlew on doing it the way that Dan was talking about with it at the top. So someone said, have you tried baker's fondant to bring the hives up to weight? And I'll start with that one, and then maybe Dan could fill in. So bees definitely prefer liquid feed, and the liquid feed is nice because they don't have to have water in order to digest it, because bees do not have teeth. Thankfully, that would be terrifying, I think. And so they can't actually chew the sugar. They have to dissolve it with water. And so it's a lot more work for them to manage solid feed. So if we have the option of giving them liquid feed, that's better. Where the fondant is used, which we'll talk about a lot soon, is in the winter time when it's too cold for them to take in the liquid. So I don't know how, I think it would be really hard for them to get up to weight and for them to actually deal with the amount of food they would need. But if you can't get them up to weight in the fall, that's when the fondant comes useful in the winter. So I don't know if anyone wanted to add to that. Clarence, you can chime in too if you have ideas. Um, so Dan, do you want to talk about this one? This is again with the feeders. And I don't know this one. So the temperature difference between night and daytime, that it is safe, so no pressure changes as the temp rises, does not express the syrup. So I think they're talking about where a bucket feeder won't lose the vacuum.
Yeah, I've never had that issue. Saying that I prefer frame feeders and top feeders for most of my feeding. So I can't give a great answer other than that. I have used bucket feeders in typical Michigan conditions where say it'd been, it's going to be 70-ish and then maybe down to 40 in that range. And I have not had issues with that. So I don't have specifics, but I think it would have to be a pretty extreme temperature swing to have an issue with that. Also, keep in mind, especially if you've got your bucket feeder inside like a shell, an empty box, there is some warmth above the hive. It's not getting the full environmental swing of temperatures. That dead air space that the bucket is sitting in is going to be warmer than the ambient overnight at 5 a.m. or whatever the cold point is.
And I do know two people who have done just that. One was up in the Traverse City area, and one is in Southeast Michigan, that actually kept top feeders with syrup the whole year or the whole winter, but they had them in an insulated box. And so it never froze when it was right on top of the cluster. And so they actually kept them. So someone he moved out of Michigan but was selling insulated boxes. So it really depends on what you're keeping it in. Um, all right, Anna, do you want to start with this one? And I have the labels up if you want. So could you comment on feeding while treating with Formic or Apiguard, and why not if the bees are starving?
Yeah, so I mean, the main thing is that we have to follow the labels. The labels are the laws. For Apigard's label, you should definitely read it thoroughly and double check, but I don't see any restrictions regarding feeding. So you'd be, as far as I can tell, able to feed and treat at the same time. For Formic Pro's label, it does say colonies should have good food reserves prior to treatment and should not be fed in hive during treatment. So if you're really worried about your bees starving, I would deal with that issue first and then get a treatment on them when they're okay.
And then I just put in the link, Vita, who makes Apiguard, has a little frequently asked questions page, and they say, the Q is, can I feed my colonies whilst using Apiguard? And the answer is yes and no. The recommendation is not to apply Apiguard while feeding simultaneously in case the bees spend all their time taking feed and not bothering to clean out the Apiguard gel, which also seems kind of rare. But then they say, this is not high risk and will vary between different colonies. So if you have to feed and treat at the same time, try it in a few colonies first and see how the bees react. That one is a very long treatment. It's on there for a long time. But with that one, they have to go up and move the gel around. But so I think that one's probably pretty fine. And with the Formic too, it does say not to do it on the label, whereas the Apiguard says that it's fine on, or doesn't say anything against it on the label. Okay, Dan, here's one on crystallization of honey. I'm going to read it as worded, but I think we could talk about crystallization more general. So this person's in California. Yay. I have orange blossom honey that slightly crystallizes in the quart glass jars, but does not crystallize in the 1 pound plastic squeeze bottle. The honey was at 16.5% when pulled. This has not happened in years past. Everyone that I've talked to about this has no ideas why this has happened. Any thoughts?
So I don't have thoughts on plastic versus glass, why one would and one wouldn't. Um, Other than maybe you probably weren't alternating between plastic and glass when you filled. So maybe there's, a slight differences in the source honey, or some was out of the bottom of the tank versus the top of the tank and had some seed crystals in it or something like that. But I don't know the actual material would matter. Maybe, but I'm not aware of it. And the fact that not happening in years past, honey's going to be different from year to year, depending on what's blooming. I mean, it's citrus, orange blossom honey, but it's very likely got some other, um, you know, citrus blooms at a time when potentially a lot of other things bloom in that window in California. So there could be some other things. One year they had a good bloom, another year they didn't. And the nectar source really impacts how prone honey is to crystallization. Also, when it was harvested, how it was handled, temperatures, all those kind of things from year to year. It doesn't surprise me that there would be a little variability in its, how prone it is to granulation. So I guess those would be my thoughts on it.
That's a good point about being different parts of the batch. Like not alternating. The other thing is it could be storage too, if they were stored. So the things that determine crystallization just in general are temperature. So like right around 50 degrees is where honey loves to crystallize the most. And then the ratio of the glucose to fructose in there. So if it was just held at a little bit of different temperature and had a little more seed crystals, it could go. Anna, I've got some more varroa for you. So there's a mite question. They had a mite count of 11% and first treat, but at least they're checking. And first treated the hive with one Formic Pro strip 2 weeks ago. After 10 days, they inserted the second strip of Formic Pro. I did install a temporary vent in Lower Michigan. Is my queen doomed with the 90 degrees today and tomorrow?
So we don't know exactly when they placed the second strip. The label says outside daytime highs should be between 50 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit on day of application. Hot temperatures, in parentheses, greater to or equal than 92 degrees Fahrenheit during the first 3 days may lead to excessive bee, brood, and queen loss. So kind of, we don't know if your queen's doomed. She might be totally fine. I would just leave it as is, let the treatment finish up, and then once the treatment's over, go in, see if you have any queen issues. And then if you do, that's something that you can troubleshoot. I'm glad that you are taking mite management seriously, especially with a high mite count of 11% infestation. That's warrants a treatment for sure. So,
And I
and
mean,
then also I would say, what's that?
oh, I was gonna say at 11%, the hive was doomed. So whether or not the queen, at least now you have a chance for it. So
Yeah, and that might be something where you're, after this treatment's over, you're checking the queen and everything, and then you're continuing to manage mice for as much time as you can before winter.
And Anna, Dan, and I all have used Formic quite a bit in hot summers and don't see huge amounts of queen loss. Like I definitely don't feel that it's something that's instant death for queens. And even if you see a little brood damage, it comes back really, really nice and fine, and you still have plenty of season left in Lower Michigan. Dan, how do you avoid swarming if you're feeding syrup and the bees are backfilling the brood nest area?
So I mean, some of that is their biology, just like this is not swarming time of year. So unless you're really going, at a certain point you stop feeding, like they've got enough. And yeah, I guess I've never fed my way into swarming issues in the fall, and I feed aggressively, I would say. I'd say if I can get 4 gallons in something in 10 days, I'll do it. If they'll take it. So I guess, it's checking, it's monitoring, and they say that their natural inclination this time of year, that their brood nest is contracting. So as those cells hatch out, just the queen's natural, she's not going to be laying as many eggs to fill every hatching cell. They want to shrink it down and tighten it up. So there is going to be more space available as bees emerge. And I guess I've not found it to be a problem of feeding my way into fall swarming.
I agree. All right, so the last question is, I'll take it, but it's, can you talk a little about the new oxalic treatment, Varoxan? It's supposed to be available this August. So Varoxan is an oxalic acid-based treatment where it is in some strips that you put in the hive for a long time. So it's similar to what people have been kind of trying to hand make a little, or a lot of people have read on like Randy Oliver's things about ways that you kind of impregnate like different cellulose materials with oxalic acid. And now there is one that will be legally available. So it's already been federally approved, and they're going through the process of getting it approved at each of the states. We did a little trial with it last year. So we had about 40 hives with different treatments in it. So about 10 of them had Varroxan in it. So it's not a huge trial, but we did at least get the experience to work with it. And we put it in mid-June, and then you leave it in for about 56 days, I think, or 60 days. And we did alcohol washes before we put it in, 2 weeks after putting it in, at 60 days, and then we used Formic and wash and checked again. And we actually found that it worked really well. We had one colony that had really high levels of mites, and it brought it down and maintained it. But that's again one colony, so you take that with what it with a grain of salt. And then we had other colonies that it was able to keep it down through that system. So where I think it would work really, really nicely is that you could, do some, if you had high mite levels, you could do something like Formic, or that works kind of more quickly. And then you have Varroxan on the whole summer while you've got your honey supers on. So you don't have to take honey supers off and put them back on. It will be labeled to allow for the honey supers on, I believe. Obviously, you're going to do the label. The one thing is it's one strip per 2.5 frames of bees. So some of our colonies had 4 strips in them, because when we were putting them in June. So it was a lot, but it was very easy to work with. It was a cardboard that was really, really stiff. So you could bend it in half and kind of put it over the frames, and the bees kind of moved out of the way. So it was pretty easy to apply. So it'll be, I think the thing they're targeting for is something to have during the summer while the super's on that you don't have to lift up. Dan, I saw you unmute. Did you want to add anything?
No, just
Oh,
the
okay.
same as you said, the usability I thought was really good, just as like the actual
Yeah.
getting it into colonies, the bees' reaction seemed they weren't unduly, they weren't upset by it like there when you put some things in. And just so from the applicator standpoint, I thought it was a nice product to work with. And yeah, definitely be incorporating it in next year. I think Friday it became available. Well, it's not the time of year I would use it. Like Megan said, it was one that's like, this is a summer type
Yeah.
treatment for me, so I'm not going to race out and buy some this week. But certainly, as I think through the plan for next year, and it's going to be at least in some colonies and get more experience with it.
And Anna just put the label in the chat as well. And we did compare it to the homemade version, and we're researchers, we can do whatever we want. And we've worked with the homemade version for a while. And the nice thing about this, besides it being a legal treatment, and you don't have to cook anything on your stove and all the stuff when you're dealing inside, is that it was very consistent. So the homemade one, anybody who's tried it will know that you can tell from material to material that it's different. And so you're all over the place with dosing. Whereas this, it is on the label, it's legal, and was very, very it was much more consistent compared to the homemade one. All right, so I think I closed it. That seems to be the end of the questions. So thanks everyone for all of your attention, and stay cool next week if you're in one of the places where it's going to get hot again. I'm going out for field work tomorrow, which is going to be awesome. I'm going to complain the whole time, I think. So,
And thanks, Clarence, for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I forgot to mention if there are bee clubs out there that want presentations, I can help with that too. So thank you again.
Thanks, Clarence. Bye, everyone.